Okay, my next series of videos are going to focus on the openings and games of the top chess players since 1970. And I chose six, and no doubt there's more chess players we could add to this list, but I chose Bobby Fischer, a world champion from 1972. And then I sort of put these three first because I think these are maybe my top influences, but Bobby Fischer, then Anatoly Karpov was the world champion after that, and then another strong player was Garry Kasparov, and then in recent history, very recent history, it's Vishy Anand, who's a current world champion, Vladimir Kramnik, who's been a past world champion, and then Magnus Carlsen, who's an up-and-coming player, one of the world's top players. So I decided to look at the openings that they play. That's the main focus of this video, and thereafter I can pick games and openings from them. So let's look at each player. You may find this very interesting to see what their opening play was. So Bobby Fischer, as white, he played pretty much exclusively e4. He didn't play e4 very few times. And then as white, the most common openings that appear, and sometimes with all the other players, it's also what your opponent plays. But what games were appearing when he played e4? He was playing what appeared, not to say all the time, but frequently, or more frequently, was the Sicilian, with these two variations, the Fischer-Sozin, the Richter-Rauser, the Roy Lopez. In fact, he's considered an expert in the Roy Lopez, the Chigorin, the Breyer, Smyslov in the exchange, and the French, the Winnower, and the Caro-Kann, the two knights and the pawn of Bolshevik attack. As black, the openings that frequently he played were the Najdorf, the King's Indian Defense, and the Grunfeld. And one of the reasons I'm going through this is we're going to see patterns arise. So Garry Kasparov, as white, he played e4 and d4 about equally. And as white, these are the openings that appeared. And just so you know, each one of these people I list from top down is the order of frequencies. So the Sicilian had the highest frequency. If you go back to Bobby Fischer, top down was the most common pairing opening. Then came the Roy Lopez, the Chigorin appeared with some frequency. The Nimzo Indian, the classical variation, it's where white plays Queen to c2. The Queen's Indian Defense, the Queen's Gambit Decline, and the Slav. As black, against black, or as black against e4, he mostly played c5. And I guess I should have deleted this right there. And the Najdorf and the and the Scheveningen, those two variations appearing most frequently. The King's Indian Defense and the Grunfeld Defense. Let's move on. Vishy Anand, as white, he favored e4. About 84% of his games started that way. And as white, he played these openings the most frequently. Sicilian, once again, just the Roy Lopez, the French, the Caro-Kann. You can read the variations. As black, against e4, he played sort of some various responses. Obviously, it looks like the Sicilian came up the most, and then e5 and c6 and others. So he sort of had a varied play against e4. Against d4, he played mostly knight f6 and then some frequency with d5. So he had a pretty wide variety of responses as black. And the Sicilian, the Roy Lopez, the Queen's Indian Defense, the Semi-Slav, the Queen's Gambit Accepted, which is, we haven't seen that appear yet. So no doubt some of this is stylistic. Anatoly Karpov, as white, he played d4 and e4 and others. So somewhat varied opening play as white. And then he played the these openings, the Sicilian, King's Indian, Queen's Indian, Ruy Lopez, Queen's Gambit declined, Semi-Slav is black. Against e4 he played e5 and c6 most of the time, and against d4 he played mostly knight f6, occasionally d5. So in some respects, if you have a favorite player, or maybe this is how your play is, you can see how their style fit in. Vladimir Kramnik. Once again, he's another player that has somewhat varied opening as a white, d4, knight f3, and e4. So he looks like he's more of a d4 player with these openings occurring. A lot of these are repeats from previous world champions, as you can tell. And it's black. Whoops, before I move on. Against e4, he played the Sicilian and e5 and others. And against d4, he played knight f6 and d5 about equally. As you can tell, a lot of these openings are starting to see a common theme, hopefully. And you can always pause the video to take a look. Magnus Carlsen, the recent, probably going to be world champion one day. As he plays as white, he plays e4, d4 about equally, and some others. So he has also another varied opening. And he plays the sort of seeing a lot of repeats. And then as black, he plays e4, c5, and e5. Or I'm sorry, as black against e4, he plays c5 and e5 about equally, and against d4 he plays knight f6 and occasionally d5. So here actually we see some variation in his Sicilian play. So like I said before, sometimes it's not exactly the Magnus picking the opening, but he'd probably pick the Najdorf or the Dragon if you're picking black. So what can we learn? And this is where I'm going to go with this, is that so the openings I'm going to be covering between these players, high frequency, you see the Sicilian, the Najdorf, and the Scheveningen appearing most frequently. With the Ruy Lopez, you see the Breyer, Chagor, and the Exchange, and the Richter Rauser the most. With the Nimzo Indian, you see the classical variation. Not to say these are the only variations, but they appear with some frequency. The Queen's Indian Defense, the King's Indian Defense, and the Queen's Gambit decline. These are high frequency openings, and I've covered these in my opening lectures, but let me cover some games and go over them in more detail. Medium frequency, the Grunfeld Defense, the Slav, and the Semi-Slav. It looks like in more recent time the Slav and the Semi-Slav are gaining popularity, or appearing more. So no doubt maybe this is just a trend in our time. The lower frequency, I'm going to call the French, especially with e4 players. You see actually the French appearing in Bobby Fischer's, and I think it was Anand who plays 84% e4. You see the French appearing, and then the Caro-Kann, the Steinitz variation appearing, the Caro-Kann the most frequently. So that's how my lectures are going to appear. I'm actually going to try to cover these players and these openings and discuss them in further detail.